The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with, even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. Today is day 6 of this 7-day session here at Mountain Gate in northern New Mexico. And it's quite exciting that we are going strong, and it's important to keep it on because there have been so many instances, of course, in any profession or any environment where there's a power disparity between people. There's always here and there are people who are insufficiently cooked, as the expression goes in Buddhism, and they give way to unethical behavior. And that has happened, of course, as you know, most likely well, in Buddhism also, where one would hope it would not happen, particularly among teachers. But there have been some very notable examples of quite abusive behavior among Buddhist teachers in America in the past, and I hope that there is none going on now. I haven't heard of any, but the ones that have happened in the past were pretty high profile. Not only high profile, but also lasted for decades, because the Sangha members who heard about it denied it, said, oh, he's just trying to teach you. Or in one case, all is emptiness. Therefore, there is nobody hurting anybody and nobody being hurt. That is a very shallow view. Yes, emptiness is something that is an aspect of a process towards awakening, is to recognize the emptiness of phenomena. But that is not the end. And people mistaken this for the end. An experience of emptiness has to be moved through so that one experiences not only the emptiness of phenomena, but the phenomena that are imbued with emptiness, but are still form. There's form and there is emptiness. And it goes beyond that in terms of the degree of awakening possible for human beings. And those of us who have chosen to do Zen practice, it's really almost a responsibility for us. In fact, I would say it's a responsibility for us to continue to the full depth of awakening. In the Mahayana view, and Rinzai Zen is Mahayana Buddhism, we practice, we come to awakening for the benefit of all beings in order to relieve suffering in the world, not to create it. And so it is absolutely vital to continue the practice, including the practice of what often can take years or even decades of reaching a point where you're cleared out enough, able to see clearly enough that you have initial kensho experiences. And kensho means, in Japanese, seeing into, meaning seeing into the nature of reality. And that is only the beginning. As Kalu Rinpoche said, and actually it's the title of a book of his teachings, a flash of lightning in the dark night. This is just the beginning. He wrote that if you're climbing up a mountain, you're on this path that's unfamiliar, and you're feeling your way along in the pitch black dark, which is not unlike practice in general. And suddenly there's a flash of lightning and you see briefly the path ahead. And so now you know better where you're going and how to get there. But that's not the end. That's a beginning. In being able to see at least something of how our minds truly are, then it's very different in your practice, and you can go deeper. It reinstitutes faith. When you've seen something and you experience a level of freedom as a result of that seeing. And then if it's a deep enough seeing and you're working with a teacher, hopefully you are working with a teacher, because it's all too easy to misinterpret a particular mind state that feels really great as awakening, when it is often simply a major Mykyo and has nothing to do with awakening at all. Our minds are so skilled at throwing dust in our eyes. It's not so much our minds, it's the investment in a self-image, in maintaining, in protecting, and defending a self-image. So once we have an initial kensho that is deep enough, we continue working, and that is vital. We work with a teacher doing subsequent koan work if we're doing Rinzai Zen practice, and we continue to deepen. The subsequent koans have many different categories of types of koans. I won't get into them here, but they are specific to helping us expand certain aspects of our mind, of that initial opening. And it's essential to work on these with a teacher. You really can't do it any other way. But all along the way, it is vital to do what Torei Enji, who was Hakuin's premier descendant, Dharma successor, said. It's called the long maturation. And that long maturation doesn't necessarily begin when you've had kensho. It begins the moment you step on the cushion, or I should say step into the zendo and sit on the cushion or in the chair. And it is as we open our mind and become more clear, more let go, more aware, we begin to see, as part of that increased clarity, our behavior. Bits and pieces. It doesn't happen all at once by any means. It happens as we continue our practice. It happens over years. I'm still seeing things that I hadn't seen before. And initially, it can begin to feel like we're not doing our practice right. We're failing in our practice. We're just getting to be worse people. That's not what is happening. What is happening is we're just becoming more aware of the behavior we've been engaging in from the get-go. And here is this incredible opportunity to opt out of it. Because if it comes up and we are willing to turn and face it, to own it, which is a vital part of this process, then there's a chance to not indulge in it again. It's almost as if, as you go along your daily life, after you've seen something and you experience the regret and the shame and the difficult feelings around it, that the next time the habit would raise its ugly head again to behave in that way that was dysfunctional, it's almost as if there's a big stop sign that blinks in front of your eyes and says, wait a minute, do you really want to do that again? Do you really want to cause that pain again? And it's so easy to stop in your tracks and go in a different direction instead of indulging in that habitual behavior that was pain-producing. It's an ongoing process. It's an essential ongoing process. This is what the so-called teachers, and some of them were quite prominent, didn't do. They did not incorporate it into their own practice. Anybody practicing in this lineage is essentially committing to going the full direction, the full length of the practice, and unfolding it in such a way that when we become aware of when we are behaving not as kindly or as unselfishly or as nicely as we would like to behave, that we work on shifting that habit pattern and no longer indulging in it. The biggest names in American Zen, some of them foreigners, at least one of them, more than one of them, American, were teaching at the same time. Many of them were teaching at the same time. Most of them were teaching at the same time that Mykyo-ni was teaching. And one of the most excellent aspects of Roshi Kapleau, despite all the flack that he took, was his ethical behavior. And beyond that, and I witnessed this over and over and over again, because I trained with him a long, long time and spent a number of years in constant contact with him as his secretary or his attendant. And so I know how this man behaved. And it was not only ethical, it was kindly, and every time he saw where he was behaving in a less than optimal way, it stopped in its tracks. It was remarkable. This man kept working on his practice to the very moment he was dying, and I'm sure including the moment he died. This is our model, to keep working on ourselves. And I want to share some things from a very excellent book, a discourse on the inexhaustible lamp. And it was the writings of Toray Inji. This is, as you heard, Hakuin's premier Dharma successor. And in this particular volume, which is quite fat, it is translated by Mykyo-ni, who was the Rinzai authorized teacher at Zen Center London. And also within that book, which is an advantage of that book over the Cleary translation, which is readily available on Amazon.com, there was a 20th century contemporary master named Dai Bi, who gave commentaries on this treatise on the inexhaustible lamp. And when Mykyo-ni was training at Rinzai Monastery in Japan, she was advised to get hold of this copy of Dai Bi's commentary, as well as, of course, Toray Inji's work, and because it was so helpful, and it is. And this is why this book is so fat, because it's got Dai Bi's commentary on it. Toray Inji was an amazing, deeply dedicated Zen monk. And he actually was ordained, I think, as a child, something around the age of 8, and seems to have been truly, deeply dedicated to practice for the benefit of all beings his entire life. He resisted Hakuin's efforts to make him into a teacher. Hakuin had him installed at Ryutakuji, Rinzai Monastery in Japan that still exists and still, at least when I was living in Japan, still was training monks and other people. And Toray got it rebuilt because I guess it was in tatters, and stayed just for a year. And then he left to go on his own pilgrimage and do his own deepening training. As far as we know, Torei never stopped training, just like Mykyo-ni. So I'd like to start sharing some of his words and also some of the commentary of Mitra-roshi, from this book. Genuine insight, this is Torei. Genuine insight into one's true nature only emerges in the midst of great doubt and great faith. It is not the result of accumulated learning and discrimination. This is why great faith is so vital, because we are flying blind, just like hiking up that mountain path in the pitch black dark. We have to trust that we are going in the most appropriate direction we can go in, and that if we keep on going, we will eventually open and our life will be transformed. And then we continue training and the transformation continues. Great doubt refers to this sense that there's something beyond what we can ordinarily know with our heads, with our intellect. It also can be a question, wordless or worded. And in fact, Mykyo-roshi's question was about suffering, because he was a court reporter, head court reporter, actually. I don't remember whether it was Nuremberg or Japan. He was a court reporter both places for the war crimes trials. And he, among other things, he saw a very vast difference between the German reaction to being put on the stand to defend themselves in their terrible actions during the Second World War, and the Japanese, who apologized. And he wondered then what there was about Japan, that the Japanese culture, that the Japanese generals and so on could have that different view. And so when he went back to the United States after Japan, which was the second set of trials, he enrolled in a number of courses with D.T. Suzuki at Columbia University. And then eventually decided to go and experience Zen practice himself. And the rest is history. There was a man who came to Mykyo-ni 20 years after the Battle of Normandy. He had been in that battle, and he was so shocked at the devastation of human life, at the sheer volume of suffering that was rampant there, that when he was sent back home to New York City, apparently, after the war, all he could do was wander New York City, just wondering, why is there suffering? Why is there so much suffering? And after 6 months of being so deeply engrossed in that question that he'd bump into street poles and so on, because he was so engrossed, he had some level of awakening experience. It was apparently relatively mild, but it was significant enough that 20 years later, on somebody's recommendation, he came to see Mykyo-ni to see what had happened and what he could do about it. And Mykyo-ni said he could re-up the experience and expand it if he started doing Zazen. By that time, this experience of insight was just a dim memory on the part of this man, but it was so significant to him that he wanted to get it back. And there are many other stories. there's an interesting one that got played out in a documentary called Project Grizzly. A Canadian man was hiking in the bush far, far away from civilization. And he had a backpack on, a big fat backpack on, because he was in the forest for an extended period of time. He had a knife in one hand and his rifle in the other. And he'd been hiking along, and he began to realize he felt like he was being watched. For about 3 days, he felt like he was being watched. And as he's hiking along, he comes into a clearing, and boom, there is a grizzly bear. And he was so shocked that he fell backwards. The knife went flying, the rifle went flying, and he's lying there propped up in a sort of semi-sitting position by his pack. And something happened in his mind. He stood up and, fearless, faced this bear, which came to him and bumped his nose into his chest, and then turned around and walked away. But the experience was so phenomenal to him, the amazing sense of freedom, that he spent hundreds of thousands of dollars and years trying to perfect a bear-proof suit so that he could have that same experience again. Of course, it would never happen with a bear-proof suit, because the reason why he had had that experience was he allowed himself to be truly naked and let go. Of course, one could have said that he had an insight. It wasn't deep enough, and of course, he had no background for it, nor anyone to say, hey, there's a different way you could deal with this and experience it again, and it doesn't have to cost a lot of money, and you don't have to go through all this business of trying to create a bear-proof suit. The video is quite funny if you watch it. It's quite old, but in fact, the form we have is not even a DVD; it's a video. But perhaps you can find it on the internet if you're interested. And these are some examples of why people yearn to go to open more. Let's put it that way. And what motivates people? With the Buddha himself, of course, it was why? Why is there suffering? Why? We're born, and all we have to look forward to is old age, sickness, and death? What is the point? And of course, he took it to the full extent of profound awakening. So can we. But to stop at a single kensho is not sufficient. To continue. When the time is ripe, it appears of itself. We can't make it happen. It happens because we have let go enough of who we think we are through the self-absorption. Be careful about that word self. Through the absorption, maybe is a better way to put it, of the practice. Letting go, daring to pull that sentry out of the sentry box and simply dive into the practice so completely that you forget yourself again and again and again. And then suddenly it can happen. But it has to be emphasized that that is only a beginning, but it's a major, significant beginning. It is relatively easy to accomplish the important matter of insight into one's true nature, but uncommonly difficult to function freely and clearly according to this understanding. And this is what I'm talking about. This is why we have to persist in motion and in rest, in good and in adverse circumstances. Please make strenuous and vigorous efforts towards this end. Otherwise, all the teachings of the Buddha and the patriarchs become mere empty words rather than the living Dharma. Let's read that again. It's seriously important. It is relatively easy, although it may not feel like it. It is relatively easy to accomplish the important matter of insight into one's true nature, but uncommonly difficult to function freely and clearly according to this understanding, in motion and in rest, in good and in adverse circumstances. Please make strenuous and vigorous efforts towards this end. Otherwise, all the teachings of Buddha and patriarchs become mere empty words rather than the living Dharma. Tread the path of sincere practice with uninterrupted concentration. And we need to add that, of course, there's going to be lots of interruptions. Of course, it's going to be difficult to keep your mind on your practice. But as you get practiced, which is, of course, why it's called practice, it will get easier and easier. Once things have become clear, then it is time to take up and penetrate the sayings of the sutras and masters. The part that he calls the long maturation. Some more words. These are from Daibi. To be in the state of Satori, or in that of the Western paradise, or in the heavenly realm, being idle all day, is no cause for rejoicing. It's an eddy. It's a stopwater. It's a blind alley. It's a trap. In the world, there are many religions advocating love and preaching salvation. But perhaps only Mahayana Buddhism stresses benefiting other beings, even to the extent of throwing oneself into the 6 realms of being and the 4 modes of birth. This is emphasized particularly in our school due to our faith in the existence of that wonder-arousing, mysterious state, and that it is attainable, because it is. So in the training after Satori, we need to break our bones and forge ourselves again and again. This is the Japanese culture here, but we can translate that as after Satori, we have to really work at bringing it to life in our daily life. And what that requires is seeing where our behavior is not in line with what we have begun to realize, and to realize more deeply so that we can increase that letting go and that transformation so that we can truly be there to relieve suffering and not add to it. Todayenji was already practicing. He'd already had a kensho before he arrived at Hakuin's temple. In fact, he was in his early 20s, I think, when he went to Hakuin, very early 20s, because it was when he was 26 that he was struck by the illness that he seemed to be dying from, the one where the doctors gave up on him. There's some possibility it may have been TB. Who knows what it was. It was long enough ago in the 18th century that there wasn't the scientific information that is available now to pinpoint exactly what is going on with people. And he was so dedicated to practice that he decided that if he was to die, he would accept that. There was no problem with that. And he would just rest when he needed to rest. And the rest of the time, he would try to write down, to document in essence, what he knew, what he understood about Zen practice. Having done it for something like 15, 20 years. No, not 20, but 15, almost 20 years. and having had a Kensho experience and being utterly dedicated to practice. And he felt like at least if he was going to die, then at least there was that understanding that possibly could benefit others on the path. And when it was done, he wrote to Hakuin. Actually, what happened was that Hakuin wrote him a letter and asked him to come and visit. And by this time, he was starting to be better, and he actually did recover. I think he lived into his 70s. So he went to Hakuin as requested and took the treatise with him and handed it to Hakuin and said, if this is something that you feel like could be valuable, then it's yours. Do with it as you will. And if you don't think it's appropriate, if you don't think it's correct, then please burn it. And obviously it didn't get burnt. And so now we have the advantage of using it as our own guide. And it is quite a thorough exposition of training, the reasons for training, the background of training, the lineages, and so on and so forth, which is why it's so thick a book. And again, the Cleary translation of this book is available on Amazon.com still, as far as I know. But if there's a chance of getting hold of this other, the London Zen Center version, which I think you could probably Google it and find it, because people are continuing to be able to find this. I think it costs about approximately $40, translated from euros. And I think you can buy it in dollars. But I would highly recommend it. It's been a deep inspiration for me. And it tells it like it is, that this practice is serious. This practice is transformative, hugely transformative, deeply transformative. And the potential within this practice for relieving suffering is enormous. And those of us who have stepped on the path, we can continue on. Yes, it's difficult, but it's difficult only because we're facing our own stuff. It's not difficult because it's difficult. It's difficult because we are invested in our own view and our own self-image. It's difficult because we have conditioning from birth onward in this lifetime, not to mention whatever we brought in from previous lives. We have habit patterns of dysfunction that we are unaware of because we don't want to think we behave in those ways. Who would? And yet, unwittingly, we do, not even realizing it. And it's an incredible, effective way to undo that negative conditioning, undo those dysfunctional habit patterns, and as part of the process of experiencing increasing freedom. And when I say freedom, it's not the kind of, quote, freedom that the Beat generation, when they first adopted Zen, assumed it was. Like, you could hang out and do anything you felt like, and it was fine. It was real Zen. Well, it wasn't. It was just being self-indulgent. But real freedom is what Jacques Lassaron experienced in Buchenwald after he had a great awakening experience. It's like Flora Courtois, an American woman that I knew personally, experienced as a college student, and how it continued into the rest of her life. It's like all of us can experience. It means even if we're locked in our houses with the threat of death because of the pandemic that's raging right now, we are free. It's not a problem. Whatever constraints might be placed on us, whatever difficulties we might encounter in our lives, incredible difficulties we might encounter in our lives, there is still this amazing freedom in the midst of it. There was an American murderer named Frankie Parker who was so incorrigible that he spent something like years in solitary confinement as punishment for his behavior, even in prison. Frankie Parker had grown up abused, and he murdered at least one woman and attempted to murder her 9-year-old daughter. And the daughter somehow survived. And I think there may have been another person also who was killed. At any rate, he was caught and sent to prison. And I think he was actually condemned to death. He, during one of his stints in solitary confinement, a guard, supposedly as a joke, tossed a copy of the Dhammapada into his cell. Dhammapada was the collection of the teachings, the earliest teachings of the Buddha. And there's a section that's called linked verses. And he was reading these verses. You are what you think, having become what you thought, and so on and so forth. And it somehow, a light bulb went on in him, and he completely transformed. Someone appeared to teach him how to do Zazen. And he not only practiced Zazen deeply, he also taught other inmates how to do Zazen, and his behavior radically changed for the positive because of what he had experienced within himself. So even in the midst of prison with a death sentence, he had found freedom. There are stories of prisoners in the Russian Gulag, same thing. Even in the midst of terrible environment of ongoing abuse, they could be free. Their bodies weren't free, but their minds were. So the deeper we can go, the more let go we can become, the more we can open our arms and embrace the discomfort when we see where we are being dysfunctional, when we see where we are causing pain and suffering and we didn't even realize it before. And we make attempts to not only to make up for it and to apologize if that's possible, but also not to do it again. And we continue that ongoing and become, as part of that, more and more and more and more free. And at a certain point, it becomes quite joyful. We're so grateful for this practice. We're so grateful to see where we're caught, because then we can do something about it. We don't have to be prisoner of our own conditioning. But it's essential in order to reach this point that we have to put effort into it to continue far beyond any Kensho experience. And for anyone who hasn't had a Kensho experience after however many years of Zen training, take heart. There was a man named John, I can't remember his last name anymore, but he was an art teacher in Buffalo, New York. And he came to every single Sunday morning sitting and many sessions in Rochester at the Rochester Zen Center. And after he'd been practicing, and he told me this personally, after he'd been practicing for 13 years, and he was thinking, oh no, it's 13 years and I haven't had Kensho. And he went into Mykyo-ni during Doksan, and he said, I haven't had Kensho yet. I've been practicing 13 years. And Mykyo-ni said to him, 13 years? 30 years? And he said, he doesn't remember what else Mykyo-ni said, because all of a sudden it just didn't matter. And after 20 years, he had a very deep Kensho. There is Joshu, who spent decades practicing, decades and decades and decades, and didn't even start teaching until he was quite old. Just kept practicing, just kept practicing, just kept practicing. Ultimately awakened deeply. It doesn't matter how long it takes. That's irrelevant, really. That we reach it eventually is important, but every inch of practice along the way, every minute of practice along the way is cumulative, as my good friend Frank Howard said, and Frank is still practicing. And he told me that back in the 1970s. It's important to persist. It's important to keep going and not ever to assume that you're done. There is always more to open to, always more to transform from. And it becomes an incredibly joyful practice. So I thank you for listening. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.